And in this lecture, we're going to talk about early Spanish colonization in Texas. In April of 1690, Governor Alonso de Leon of Coahuila and Father Damian Massanet established a mission in East Texas among the Hasinai Indians. They were known to the Spanish as the Teyas, and this is where Texas gets its name. The Hasinai word for friendly or friend is Tejas, T-E-J-A-S. You can see how this happened. The Spanish greet the Teyas, and they beat their chest and say, Tejas, Tejas, which is friend, friend. And the Spanish thinks they're calling themselves the Teyas. They're in fact the Hasinai. The mission was known as San Francisco de los Teyas in what is now East Texas. The Franciscans celebrated their first Mass there on June 1st, 1690. The governor wanted to leave soldiers, but Massanet disagreed, insisting on leaving only 5 priests. Both men advocated for future action in Texas. In 1691, the Viceroy of New Spain gave Texas its own governor, Domingo Terán de los Rios, who started out with an expedition for Texas in 1691. The Spanish brought with them large numbers of cattle, sheep, and horses. The mission San Francisco de los Teyas barely survived by the time Terán got there. Friction with the Caddos had led to violence between the two sides, and only 2 priests were still alive in 1691. Terán headed north, reaching the Red River in Arkansas, and finally turned back, disenchanted with Texas, and departed back to Mexico from Matagorda Bay in March 1692. Instead of founding 8 new missions as he had planned to, he left a handful of priests and soldiers in the one existing mission. And of course, you can see on the map there the location of Mission San Francisco de los Teyas. With the French threat to Texas now fading, the Spanish viceroy sent an expedition to recall the priests, and Mission San Francisco de los Teyas was abandoned in early 1694. For almost 20 years, the Spanish lost interest in Texas, but with the founding of French settlements along the Gulf Coast, like Biloxi in what is now Mississippi, Mobile, and New Orleans, the Spanish interest in Texas revived due to the perceived French threats. In 1703, the Spanish founded Presidio San Juan Bautista del Rio Grande on the Rio Grande, about 30 miles below Eagle Pass. And Presidio San Juan Bautista would serve as the gateway to Spanish Texas throughout the rest of the 16th century. Presidio, of course, is Spanish for fort. Father Hidalgo, a Spanish priest and enthusiast about Christianizing Texas, sent a letter to Governor Cadillac of Louisiana in 1711. It's Governor Cadillac there on your slide. In 1713, when the letter reached Cadillac, the Frenchmen saw an opportunity to expand French trading into the area and sent an expedition under Louis Juchereau de Saint-Denis into Texas to approach the Spanish about a joint Christianizing venture between the two empires. In July of 1714, Saint Denis and his small company rode into Presidio San Juan Bautista, and finally, the Spanish were sufficiently alarmed again to try permanent settlement in Texas. In the spring of 1716, an expedition led by Captain Domingo Ramon started out for East Texas from Presidio San Juan Bautista to found 4 new missions. In the summer of 1716, he reached the piney woods of East Texas and established the missions. The one was near the original site of San Francisco de los Teyas. Another, called Nuestra Senora de Guadalupe, was where present-day Nacogdoches is located. The next year, in 1717, they founded 2 more missions, one near present-day San Augustine that was called Nuestra Senora de los Dolores, and one called San Miguel de los Adayes in what is now western Louisiana, near the town of Natchitoches, Louisiana. The missions were protected by Spanish soldiers located in a central presidio that was also called Nuestra Senora de los Dolores, and these missions faced many of the same problems that had faced the original Mission San Francisco de los Teyas. They're isolated, they're far from Presidio San Juan Bautista, and they are close, relatively close to the French Empire and French settlements in what is now western Louisiana. In 1716, the Viceroy of New Spain appointed a new governor of Texas, Martin de Alarcón, and instructed him to found a mission on the San Antonio River as a halfway point between Mission San Juan Bautista and the missions in East Texas. On May 1st, 1718, Alarcón founded Mission San Antonio de Bolero, later known as the Alamo, and also a presidio, San Antonio de Bejar, 5 miles west of the mission. And of course, Presidio San Antonio de Bejar and the Mission San Antonio de Bolero, this was the settlement around which San Antonio would grow up. In 1719, a war between Spain and France prompted the French to raid San Miguel de los Adayes, and they captured the mission without much resistance. They moved on and captured all the Spanish missions in East Texas. The soldiers and priests fled west to Mission San Antonio de Bolero. Father Antonio Margil de Jesus sought and got permission to found a second mission near San Antonio, known as San Jose y San Miguel de Aguayo, named after the governor of Texas. Governor Aguayo led an expedition up from the Rio Grande in March of 1721 with 500 men, accompanied by 2,800 horses, 4,800 head of cattle, and 6,400 sheep and goats. Aguayo moved through San Antonio, and he and his men recaptured all the missions, including Los Adayes, and the French, because of the size of his army, did not oppose him, but instead signed a truce. Los Adayes became the capital of Spanish Texas and remained the capital until 1772. And of course, this is the introduction of these horses, cattle, sheep, and goats, is when horses, cattle, sheep, and goats were largely introduced into Texas. Aguayo also founded a presidio at the site of La Salle's old colony, known as Presidio La Bahia, which eventually moved to the site of present-day Goliad. The Spanish missions in East Texas met very little success in converting Native Americans there to Christianity, but the missions in the San Antonio area experienced more success. The most important contribution, though, perhaps, of the Spanish missions in East Texas was ranching. The introduction of large numbers of cattle, sheep, goats, and horses reshaped the Texas landscape through the agency of vaqueros and shepherds. And of course, the introduction of all of these animals also allowed mesquite to spread across Texas. During this time period, the Spanish tried to convert Native Americans to Christianity, while the French pursued a more trade-oriented relationship with the indigenous peoples. In the mid-1720s, the Spanish again began losing interest in Texas, and budget cuts closed down the Presidio in East Texas, leaving the missions there unprotected. The priests reacted by moving the missions to San Antonio. The missions at Nacogdoches, San Augustine, and Los Adayes still existed, as did the Presidio near Los Adayes, but the cutbacks in the missions doomed any Spanish efforts to populate East Texas. Meanwhile, the population of San Antonio continued to grow steadily in the 18th century, mainly because of the influx of soldiers, priests, and missions from East Texas. San Antonio also gained 3 missions during this time, bringing the total to 5. In 1731, 55 Canary Islanders also arrived to settle in San Antonio, and San Antonio became the focal point of Spanish Texas from the 1730s onward. If you go to San Antonio today, the central plaza of the city is known as the Plaza de Isleños, the Plaza of the Islanders. That is named after the Canary Islanders. These Canary Islanders, of course, also founded San Fernando Cathedral, which was in San Antonio to this day. Now, the population growth in San Antonio also gave way to increased warfare between the Spanish and the Lipan Apaches. The Comanches also arrived in Texas in the 1720s, putting pressure on the Apaches and prompting the Apaches to renew raids on Spanish settlements. The Spanish did not officially come into contact with the Comanches until the 1750s. And on the right, you can see an artist's depiction of a Lipan Apache warrior. In the mid-1740s, the Spanish again launched 4 separate initiatives to establish new missions and presidios in Texas, but 3 of these 4 failed. The first Spanish initiative involved settling a new series of missions 130 miles northeast of San Antonio along the San Gabriel River in modern-day Milam County. Father Mariano Francisco de los Dolores y Viana began the San Gabriel missions in 1746 by establishing the first mission, San Francisco Javier de Nájera, and by July 1749, 3 missions were ready to work with the Native Americans, 1 with the Tonkawas, 1 with the Cocos, and 1 for the Dedos. Finally, in 1751, the Viceroy of New Spain authorized the building of a presidio, San Francisco Javier de Higuero. Now, Captain Felipe de Rabago y Terán took command of the presidio and proceeded to make waves. He had affairs with the wives of the men under his command. In the spring of 1752, one of the soldiers under Rabago and a priest were murdered after the soldiers of the garrison had been excommunicated for raping Native American women. The murders convinced the priests and missionaries to flee, abandoning all hope of establishing a mission field on the San Gabriel. The missions survived 3 more years until they were moved to the San Marcos River in 1755. The second major Spanish attempt to found missions during this period focused on establishing missions northwest of San Antonio along the San Saba River. They attempted to establish these missions for the Lipan Apaches. In the spring of 1757, Colonel Ortiz Parilla transferred the properties of the abortive missions along the San Gabriel from the San Marcos River up to the San Saba. Father Terreros established Mission Santa Cruz de San Saba and Presidio San Luis de las Amarillas. In March of 1758, Apaches began raiding Comanche camps, and the Comanches retaliated against the Apaches and their allies, the Spaniards, by raiding the mission on March 16, 1758. This prompted a retaliatory raid by Colonel Parillas, and all of the fighting doomed any effort of the Spanish to found permanent missions along the San Saba. The Comanches were too much. The third Spanish attempt at spreading missions during this time period resulted from a perceived threat from the French. In 1754, the Spanish received word that a Frenchman had set up a trading post near the mouth of the Trinity River, and the Spanish then set up a mission in 1756 near present-day Anahuac, Texas, called El Orcolquisac, but this mission never really flourished and eventually was abandoned. The fourth and final attempt at spreading missions by the Spanish during this time period focused on the Gulf Coast region. José de Escandón began establishing missions in towns along the Gulf Coast in what would later become the state of Tamaulipas. Only 2 of these missions were in what is now Texas, and the only significant settlement in Texas came in the form of Villa Laredo, which was established by Tomas Sanchez at a crossing of the Rio Grande known as Paso de Jacinto in 1755. Also during this period, several Mexican ranchers moved their operations into what is now South Texas, north of the Rio Grande. Following the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, as it's more commonly known in North America, from 1756 to 1763, the French gave the Louisiana Territory to the Spanish, in part to help the Spanish recoup their losses from the war, and in part to avoid the Louisiana Territory from falling into English hands. The Spanish took possession of the Louisiana Territory in 1766. New Orleans became the headquarters of Spanish Louisiana, and Texas no longer held any significance as a buffer. This led to a retrenchment of Spanish interest in Texas and a corresponding reduction in forces and missions that would last all the way until the purchase of the Louisiana Territory by the United States in 1803.